I didn't wake up one day and decide to change my religion. There was no pressure. No one convinced me. I was just tired of feeling empty in a life that looked perfect from the outside. This isn't a story about religion. It's a story about finally meeting myself. For a long time, I smiled in public and broke in silence. I had freedom, choices, and everything people said should make me happy. But every night, when the world became quiet, something inside me felt missing. I wasn't searching for Islam. I was searching for peace. And somewhere along that quiet journey, I didn't change my religion. I found myself. For a long time, I believed I was doing everything right. I followed the path that was expected of me. I made choices that looked sensible. I built a life that, from the outside, appeared complete. People saw a woman who seemed confident, someone who was moving forward, someone who had control. But no one saw what happened when the noise stopped. At night, when the world slowed down, when conversations faded and lights dimmed, I felt it again, that quiet heaviness resting in my chest. It wasn't sadness. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Something harder to name. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, wondering why my heart felt tired even after a full day of doing enough. I wasn't broken. I wasn't unhappy. And yet, I wasn't at peace. I learned how to smile automatically. How to answer, "I'm fine," without thinking. How to move through life efficiently, productively, politely. But inside, something felt disconnected. Like I was living on the surface of my own life. There were moments when laughter felt real, but it faded quickly. Moments when happiness visited, but never stayed. And in the quiet moments that followed, I would ask myself questions I was afraid to finish. Why does everything feel temporary? Why does fulfillment slip through my hands? Why do I feel like I'm constantly chasing something I can't see? I tried to ignore those questions. I told myself I was just tired. That everyone feels this way sometimes. That I should be grateful. So I stayed busy. I filled my schedule. I surrounded myself with people. I kept moving, because movement meant distraction. Silence felt dangerous. In silence, my thoughts grew louder. In silence, my heart started speaking. And I wasn't ready to hear what it had to say. There were days when I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection, and felt like I was staring at a stranger. She looked composed, put together, but I didn't recognize her anymore. I wondered when I stopped feeling connected to myself. When life became something I managed instead of something I lived. I asked myself, quietly, carefully, is this all there is? I had freedom. Choices. Opportunities. Everything people said should make a person happy. And that made the emptiness harder to explain. Because how do you admit feeling lost when nothing is visibly wrong? How do you explain a hunger when you don't know what you're hungry for? Some nights, the feeling became unbearable. Not painful, just heavy. Like carrying a weight no one else could see. I would sit alone, scrolling through nothing in particular, searching for something that could distract me from myself. But the feeling always returned. It waited patiently. I realized then that this emptiness wasn't asking to be filled. It was asking to be understood. It wasn't demanding answers. It was inviting honesty. And honesty was terrifying. Because honesty meant admitting that the life I had carefully built was missing something essential. Not success. Not love. Not validation. Meaning. I began to notice how often my mind wandered to questions about purpose. Why am I here? What does it mean to live well? What remains when everything else fades? These questions didn't come from curiosity. They came from longing. I tried to silence them. I told myself, you're overthinking. You're being dramatic. You should focus on what you have. But no matter how much I reasoned, my heart refused to be convinced. It kept whispering the same truth. There's more. I didn't feel lost in the world. I felt lost within myself. Disconnected from something deeper. Something quieter. Something I couldn't name yet. And the more I ignored it, the louder it became. There were moments when I envied people who seemed grounded, centered. People who carried a calm I didn't understand. They moved through life with a softness that didn't come from comfort, but from certainty. I wanted that. Not excitement. Not success. I started to realize that my restlessness wasn't about dissatisfaction. It was about misalignment. I was living, but not anchored. Existing, but not rooted. And slowly, without intention, without planning, I began to listen. Not to answers, just to the ache itself. I let myself sit with the emptiness instead of running from it. And for the first time, I stopped asking how to fill the void and started asking why it existed. That was the beginning. Not of a religious journey, not of a transformation others could see, but of an inner awakening. A moment when I admitted to myself, something inside me is asking for truth, and I can't ignore it anymore. After admitting to myself that something was missing, I didn't suddenly find answers. There was no clarity no direction only awareness. Awareness that the noise I had been using to distract myself no longer worked. So I slowed down. Not because I wanted to, but because my heart wouldn't let me rush anymore. I didn't call it a search at first. Searching sounded intentional, purposeful. What I was doing felt softer than that. I was listening. I began noticing how often I avoided stillness. How quickly I reached for my phone the moment I was alone with my thoughts. How silence made me uneasy. Because silence had a way of bringing me back to myself. And I wasn't sure I liked what I found there. I tried to fill the space the way I always had. I stayed busy. I worked harder. I surrounded myself with conversations that stayed safely on the surface. But something had shifted. The distractions felt thinner now. Less convincing. They no longer drowned out the questions, they only delayed them. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I found myself reading. Not searching for truth. Not searching for faith. Just reading. About life. About purpose. About people who had asked the same questions I was asking. I didn't want answers yet. I wanted language. Words for feelings I didn't know how to name. Sometimes I would stop mid-sentence, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not discomfort, recognition. As if parts of me were quietly nodding. I noticed something strange. The more honest I became with myself, the less interested I was in arguing. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I wasn't trying to defend my beliefs or challenge anyone else's. I was tired of winning conversations and losing myself in the process. There were moments when I told myself this phase would pass. That everyone goes through periods of questioning. That it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew this wasn't restlessness. It was alignment trying to happen. I started paying attention to how different things made me feel. Some ideas made my mind active but left my heart unchanged. Others didn't excite me at all, but they brought a strange calm. Those moments stayed with me. I remember sitting alone one evening, watching the sky change colors outside my window. No music. No phone. No distractions. Just breath. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. I asked myself a quiet question. What if the emptiness I've been fighting ain't a flaw? What if it's an invitation? That thought stayed with me. It softened my resistance. I stopped trying to escape the feeling and started allowing it to guide me. I didn't wake up one day curious about Islam. That's not how it happened. It entered my life quietly, almost accidentally. A sentence I came across. A video I didn't skip. A conversation I didn't interrupt. Nothing dramatic. Just presence. What surprised me wasn't the content. It was how it made me feel. There was no pressure. No urgency. Just clarity layered with calm. I felt grounded, as if my thoughts finally had somewhere to rest. And that confused me. Because I wasn't looking for faith. I wasn't looking for change. I was simply trying to survive my own questions. At first, I resisted the feeling. I told myself it was coincidence. That I was projecting meaning onto something unfamiliar. I reminded myself of who I was, where I came from, what people expected of me. I reminded myself of everything I could lose. But something inside me asked a gentler question. What if this isn't about losing anything? That question lingered. Not loudly. Not insistently. Patiently. I noticed how different this experience felt from everything else I had tried. There was no rush. No promise of instant happiness. Just a steady sense of order in a world that had always felt chaotic inside me. I didn't understand it yet. And I didn't try to. For the first time, I allowed myself not to know. There were nights when fear crept in. Fear of change. Fear of isolation. Fear of becoming someone unrecognizable. I imagined the conversations, the misunderstandings, the distance, and my chest tightened again. But alongside the fear, there was something else. Quiet, unexplainable. It didn't shout over the fear, it stood beside it, as if reminding me that fear doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes it means growth. I began to realize that this journey wasn't pulling me away from myself. It was drawing me closer. Closer to honesty. Closer to stillness. Closer to meaning. I stopped asking, "Is this right?" and started asking, "Is this true for me?" That shift changed everything. I wasn't searching for a new identity. I was uncovering one that had been buried under expectations, noise, and fear. Somewhere in that quiet exploration, I understood something important. This wasn't about religion yet. It was about surrender. Not surrender to rules. Not surrender to labels. Surrender to truth. I allowed myself to sit with questions without demanding immediate answers. I allowed myself to feel drawn without explaining why. And slowly, the resistance softened. I didn't know where this path would lead. But for the first time in years, I trusted the direction. Because even without certainty, my heart felt steady. Anchored. That was when I realized I wasn't searching for Islam. I was searching for myself. And somehow, the search was bringing me closer to something I had never expected, yet always needed. I still remember the first moment clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quiet it was. There was no announcement, no sudden realization, no feeling of certainty. Just a pause. A moment where something inside me stopped running. It happened on an ordinary day. Nothing about the setting suggested changed. No special atmosphere, no expectation. And maybe that's why it reached me. Because I wasn't guarding myself. I came across it the way people come across things when they're not trying to find anything. The sentence, a voice, a message spoken calmly, without force. I almost ignored it. But something made me stay. At first, I listened with distance. Not curiosity, caution. I didn't want to be influenced. Didn't want to be persuaded. I told myself I was only observing. Detached. Objective. But the longer I listened, the more something unfamiliar began to settle in my chest. Not excitement. Not fear. Stillness. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't promise happiness. They didn't ask anything from me. They simply existed. And somehow that made me feel seen. I wasn't being told who to become. I wasn't being warned or convinced. I was being invited to reflect. And that invitation felt respectful, gentle. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts slowed down. My mind, usually restless, questioning, analyzing, found a place to rest. And that startled me. Because peace was not something I was used to finding in unfamiliar places. I noticed how my body responded. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing softened. There was no rush to understand everything. No urgency to decide anything. Just a quiet presence that didn't demand my attention but welcomed it. That was when emotion arrived. Not suddenly. Gradually. A warmth behind my eyes. A pressure in my chest. Not sadness. Recognition. As if something inside me whispered, "This feels right." That thought frightened me, because I wasn't ready for things to feel right. Feeling right meant facing the possibility that I had been avoiding something important. And avoidance had been my comfort. I tried to reason with myself. You're tired, You're emotional, You're projecting meaning where there is none. But the feeling didn't disappear. It stayed calm, unbothered by my resistance. I returned to it again, cautiously. Not because I wanted to believe, but because I wanted to understand why my heart felt different. Each time, the same thing happened. My thoughts quieted. My chest felt lighter. It wasn't the content that moved me most. It was the tone. There was no anger, no superiority, no fear-driven urgency. Only surrender. Only humility. Only acknowledgement of something greater without diminishing the human experience. That balance resonated deeply, because I had always felt torn between intellect and emotion, between logic and longing. This felt like permission to stop choosing between the two. I began to notice how differently I felt afterward. Not euphoric, not transformed, but grounded, as if I had touched something stable after years of standing on shifting ground. Still, I didn't call it faith. I wasn't ready to name it. Naming it would make it real. And reality felt heavy. Instead, I let the experience exist without labels. I allowed myself to sit with it the way you sit with a memory you're not ready to examine yet. There were moments when doubt returned. Sharp, protective. You don't belong here, This isn't for you, You're misunderstanding. Those thoughts came quickly, automatically, but something new happened. For the first time, the doubt didn't take over. It spoke, and then it softened. Because beneath it, there was calm. And calm doesn't argue. I realized then that this encounter wasn't challenging my identity. It wasn't erasing who I was. It was offering me space to breathe as I was. That realization shifted everything. I wasn't being pulled away from myself. I was being met. Emotion came in waves after that. Sometimes quietly, sometimes unexpectedly. A sentence would linger in my mind long after I had stopped listening. A thought would return in moments of stress or exhaustion. And each time, it carried the same quality. Stillness. I began to understand why people spoke of faith as something felt before it was understood. Because this wasn't intellectual yet. It was experiential. I didn't know what it meant. And for once, I didn't rush to find out. I let myself feel without conclusions. I let myself be moved without explanations. I let myself remain open without commitment. And in that openness, something softened inside me. A hardness I didn't realize I carried. A defensiveness born from years of needing to protect myself from disappointment. This encounter didn't promise safety, but it offered trust. Trust in something beyond my control. And that idea unsettled me in the most honest way. Because I had always believed control was how I survived. But here was something suggesting that surrender could be gentler. I wasn't ready to surrender yet, but I was ready to stop running. That night, I sat in silence again. But this time, the silence felt different. Not empty. I didn't ask questions. I didn't analyze. I just existed. And in that stillness, I noticed something profound. I felt less alone. Nothing in my life had changed. The world outside remained the same. But inside, something had shifted. A subtle alignment. A quiet recognition. This encounter didn't give me answers. But it gave me something more valuable. A sense that answers were possible. And for the first time, that possibility didn't scare me. It comforted me. That was my first encounter. Not with a religion. Not with a set of beliefs. But with a feeling I had been searching for without knowing its name. And once felt, it couldn't be unfelt. The peace didn't stay uncomplicated. It never does. Once something touches you deeply, fear is never far behind. At first, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. I continued my routines, spoke the same way, laughed at the same jokes. From the outside, everything looked normal. But inside, a quiet conflict had begun. I felt torn between two forces. One was familiar, protective, but the other was new, gentle, persistent. And they did not agree. The familiar voice reminded me of everything I could lose. Your family, your friends, your place in the world. It warned me of distance, of misunderstanding, of becoming the other. It spoke quickly, urgently, as fear always does. The gentler voice didn't argue. It didn't list consequences or demand decisions. It simply asked, what if peace is worth the discomfort? That question unsettled me, because discomfort was something I knew how to manage. But choosing peace meant stepping into uncertainty. And uncertainty felt dangerous. I began resisting the pull. I told myself I was imagining things, that the calm I felt was temporary. that I was romanticizing an idea because I wanted relief. I questioned my own sincerity. Was I being weak? Was I escaping? Was I betraying something important? Fear has a way of disguising itself as logic. And I listened. I avoided returning to what had brought me peace. Not intentionally. Subtly. I stayed busy. I filled my days again. I let noise reclaim its place. But something was different now. The noise felt heavier. Less effective. The silence waited. It always did. At night, when distractions faded, the conflict returned. Stronger. I replayed conversations in my head that hadn't even happened yet. Explanations I might have to give. Defenses I might need to build. I imagined disappointment. Confusion. Distance. And my chest tightened. I asked myself a painful question. Am I strong enough for this? Because strength, I realized, was no longer about endurance. It was about honesty. And honesty asked for courage I wasn't sure I had. Part of me wanted to go back to the way things were. To the familiar discomfort I knew how to survive. At least it was predictable. At least it didn't threaten my identity. But another part of me whispered something dangerous. You've already changed. And it was right. I couldn't unfeel what I had felt. I couldn't unknow what had resonated. The door had been opened. That realization frightened me more than anything else. Because change had begun before I gave permission. I started questioning my motives again. Why does this feel right? Why does this calm scare me? Why do I feel guilty for feeling peace? I realized then how deeply I had associated struggle with worth. How I believed that ease meant weakness. That rest had to be earned through suffering. This challenged that belief. And beliefs do not like being challenged. Resistance grew louder. I became defensive, internally. I built arguments, found reasons, clung to certainty. I told myself, you don't need this. You're fine as you are. But my heart didn't respond. It stayed quiet. And silence, I learned, is not absence. It is presence without force. Fear began showing itself in smaller ways. Hesitation. Avoidance. I delayed moments of reflection. I avoided being alone too long. Because being alone meant facing the truth I was circling. I noticed how fear didn't come as panic. It came as pressure. A constant tightening. A guarding of the heart. I realized then that fear wasn't trying to harm me. It was trying to protect the version of me it knew how to keep alive. And for that, I couldn't hate it. But I also couldn't let it lead. One night, exhausted by the inner battle, I asked myself something honestly. What am I really afraid of? The answer came quietly. Not rejection. Not loss. Becoming real. Because becoming real meant living without hiding. Without pretending. Without editing myself to fit expectations. That thought made my breath catch. Because I had spent so long surviving by adaptation. Blending adjusting softening edges. This journey threatened that survival strategy. I realized then that resistance wasn't about faith. It was about identity. Who I had been. Who people believed me to be. Who I believed I was allowed to become. And suddenly the conflict made sense. This wasn't a spiritual crisis. It was a personal one. I sat with that truth. Uncomfortable. Heavy. Necessary. I understood something important. Fear doesn't disappear when truth arrives. It stands beside it, waiting to see which one you trust. I wasn't ready to choose yet, but I was ready to stop pretending this was nothing. That night, I didn't seek peace. I acknowledged fear. I let it exist without letting it decide. And that small shift changed the tone of the conflict. The fear softened. Not gone, but less sharp, because it had been seen. I realized then that this journey wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be simple. It would require me to walk forward while still trembling. And maybe that was okay. Because courage, I learned, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep listening even when fear speaks loudly. That was the moment I stopped running from the conflict. I allowed it to exist within me. Not as an enemy, but as a threshold. And somewhere between fear and peace, between resistance and truth, I understood something quietly profound. This journey was asking me not to change who I was, but to trust who I was becoming. Surrender didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no collapse, no dramatic release, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. I didn't decide to surrender. I realized I already had. It happened in the smallest way. One morning, I woke up without the familiar tension in my chest. The questions were still there, but they no longer demanded answers. They rested. For the first time, I wasn't trying to control the process. I wasn't pushing forward. I wasn't pulling back. I was simply allowing myself to be present with whatever was unfolding inside me. That presence changed everything. Because when you stop fighting yourself, clarity has space to emerge. I noticed how my thoughts softened. Not fewer, but gentler. I no longer interrogated every feeling. I no longer demanded certainty before peace. I allowed peace to exist without justification. This was surrender. Not giving up who I was, but releasing the need to defend every part of myself. I realized then that surrender isn't weakness. It's trust. Trust that not everything needs to be held so tightly. Trust that meaning doesn't always arrive through effort. I stopped asking, "What will this cost me?" and started asking, "What is this giving me?" The answer surprised me. It wasn't answers. It was alignment. My mind and heart stopped pulling in opposite directions. I felt whole in a way I hadn't before, not complete, but coherent. Acceptance followed naturally. Not forced. Not rehearsed. I accepted that this journey didn't need to look a certain way. It didn't need approval. It didn't need explanation. It only needed honesty. I accepted my fear without letting it define me. I accepted my past without letting it chain me. I accepted uncertainty without letting it paralyze me. There was relief in that acceptance. Not the loud kind. The deep kind. The kind that settles into your bones and stays. I noticed how my inner dialogue changed. I stopped accusing myself of confusion. Stopped labeling my questions as flaws. Instead, I treated them as signs of growth. Clarity arrived slowly. Like light adjusting in a room after the curtains are opened. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Just visibility. I began to see myself clearly. Not as a collection of roles or expectations, but as a human being with a heart that longs for meaning. I realized then that my struggle had never been about belief. It was about trust. Trusting myself enough to follow what felt true even when it didn't fit neatly into my life. There was grief in that realization. Grief for the years spent resisting myself. Grief for the peace I delayed because I was afraid to be honest. But grief didn't overwhelm me. It passed gently, as grief does when it's met with compassion. I noticed how the world felt different. Not brighter, not easier, but steadier. I moved through my days with a quiet sense of intention. I listened more, reacted less. I felt anchored in something that didn't shift with circumstances. That anchor wasn't certainty. It was surrender. I stopped asking, "What if I'm wrong?" and started asking, "What if I'm finally listening?" That question didn't need an answer. It carried its own peace. I accepted that clarity doesn't mean knowing everything. It means knowing enough to take the next honest step. And for the first time, that step didn't feel heavy. It felt aligned. I realized then that surrender doesn't erase fear. It changes your relationship with it. Fear becomes a companion, not a leader. I felt free in a way I hadn't before. Not free from responsibility. Free from resistance. I understood something profound. When you stop trying to become someone else, you finally make space to become who you are. This clarity didn't make me feel superior. It made me humble. Because peace showed me how much I had been carrying unnecessarily. I learned to rest without guilt. To pause without explanation. To trust without needing permission. Acceptance wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A foundation. I didn't feel the need to announce anything. I didn't feel the need to convince anyone. The change was internal. And that made it real. For the first time, I wasn't chasing truth. I was living in alignment with it. And in that alignment, I felt something settle deep within me. I was no longer divided. I hadn't reached the destination. But I had found my footing. Surrender didn't take anything from me. It returned me to myself. That was inner clarity. Not loud, not absolute, but steady. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. Integration didn't feel like becoming someone new. It felt like returning. After surrender came something quieter, deeper. I began to live with what I had accepted. Not perfectly, not confidently every day, but honestly. There was no single moment where I said, "Now I understand who I am." Understanding arrived in fragments. In the way I breathed, in the way I listened, in the way I no longer rushed to fill silence. I noticed how my inner world felt more cohesive. The parts of me that once felt divided began to sit beside each other without conflict. My past didn't disappear. My questions didn't vanish. But they stopped fighting for control. I learned that integration isn't about erasing contradictions. It's about allowing them to exist without tearing yourself apart. I began to recognize myself again. Not the version shaped by expectation, but the one shaped by truth. She was quieter, more grounded, less reactive, but stronger in ways that mattered. I didn't feel the need to explain myself to everyone. Some people noticed it changed. Others didn't. And for the first time, that didn't unsettle me. The identity, I learned, is not something you announce. It's something you live. I stopped measuring myself by how well I fit into familiar spaces. I started asking a simpler question. Am I at peace with how I'm living? That question became my compass. Not approval. Not validation. Alignment. Living forward felt different. I moved more slowly, more intentionally. I chose my words carefully, my actions deliberately. Not because I was afraid, but because I was present. I learned how to hold my faith quietly. Not as something to prove, but as something to return to. It guided my choices without demanding attention. I realized that faith, at its core, is not about identity labels. It's about orientation. What direction does your heart face when everything else falls away? Mine had found its center. There were still moments of uncertainty. Moments when old habits resurfaced. When doubt whispered again. But doubt no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a reminder to return inward. I learned to live without rushing resolution. To allow growth to unfold at its own pace. To trust that consistency matters more than intensity. Integration meant honoring my humanity. I allowed myself to be imperfect without letting imperfection define me. I allowed myself to learn without shaming myself for not knowing sooner. I stopped asking when I would arrive. And started appreciating that I already had. Living forward didn't require certainty. It required sincerity. I noticed how my relationship with the world changed. I listened more deeply, judged less quickly. I became softer, not weaker. More open, not unguarded. I carried my story gently. Not as a declaration, but as a presence. Those who needed to hear it would feel it. Those who didn't were not required to understand. I learned to let go of outcomes. To trust that my responsibility was not to convince anyone, only to live truthfully. There was peace in that. A freedom I hadn't known before. I understood then that integration is ongoing. Identity is not fixed. It's lived. Every day. Living forward meant choosing alignment again and again. In small decisions. In quiet moments. In how I treated myself when no one else was watching. I felt rooted. Not rigid. Rooted. I no longer felt the need to escape my life. I felt present within it. And with that presence came gratitude. Not for perfection, but for clarity. Not for ease, but for meaning. I realized something profoundly simple. I hadn't lost myself in this journey. I had found her. She was there all along, waiting patiently beneath fear, resistance, and noise. Living forward meant honoring her, protecting her peace, trusting her intuition. I didn't need to announce the end of my journey, because journeys like this don't end. They deepen. And so I continue. Not chasing certainty, not defending identity, but walking with intention. This story was never about changing religion. It was about finding alignment, about becoming whole. And if there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's this. Sometimes, The bravest thing you can do is stop running from yourself. I didn't change religion. I found myself. I used to think finding myself meant becoming someone new to, but I was wrong. It meant returning to honesty, to stillness, to truth. This journey didn't give me all the answers, but it gave me peace. And sometimes, peace is the answer. I didn't change religion. I found myself. If this story resonated with you, maybe it's not a coincidence.